Hello and welcome to the next step of our neuroanatomy journey. I am Tanya Chamberlain from the Division of Anatomy here at the University of Leeds, and in this video we will be addressing the autonomic nervous system. Before we go any further, let's look at the learning objectives for this video. After this video and any necessary further study, you should be able to distinguish between the somatic nervous system and the visceral or autonomic nervous system. Distinguish between sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the ANS in terms of its function. Describe the basic organisation of the autonomic efferents using appropriate terminology. Preganglionic neuron, autonomic ganglion, postganglionic neuron, and effector. Describe the organisation of the parasympathetic nervous system. Name and locate the cranial nerves carrying parasympathetic fibres. Describe the organisation of the sympathetic nervous system. Outline the role of the sympathetic nervous system in the body's response to anxiety. Right, let's go right back to basics and convene with the first slide we ever looked at, the subdivisions of the nervous system. The nervous system is divided up into two regions. The central nervous system is composed of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, is the rest of the nerves of the body. The PNS is then further divided into the somatic nervous system, which controls the actions of the skin and the muscles, and the autonomic system, which controls the internal organs and glands. This is largely involuntary. We don't have much conscious control over the autonomic response. The autonomic nervous system is further subdivided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Let's go and recap the somatic nervous system so we can fully appreciate what we will see with the autonomic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system conveys the message from the external environment to the CNS. It is constructed of afferent fibres. These are the ones that affect a response. So these are the fibres travelling to the CNS from the outside world. And we have the efferent fibres, or the motor fibres that affect the muscles. The effector fibres travel from the CNS to the skeletal muscle. So this is how each journey is made. The afferent fibres travel towards the CNS and enter the spinal cord via the dorsal root. Its sensory body is located in the dorsal root ganglion. The efferent fibres then make their way from the spinal cord through the ventral root towards the skin and the muscle. The fibres from the ventral and dorsal root blend together but do not exchange messages to form a spinal nerve or a spinal segment. We have 31 pairs in total. At some point, I think it's fair to say we have experienced some kind of anxiety. But how do we describe anxiety? So it's a feeling of worry, nervousness or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. Pause the video and think of some of the symptoms you might feel if you experience anxiety. You'll likely have said a racing heart, heavy breathing, sweating or a dry mouth. Isn't it interesting that we have all likely picked up on similar symptoms? Well, this is because they are not unique, and in fact they are similar in all of us. This suggests that something in all of us is able to act as a master switch in response to a stressor. Well, what is it? It is, in fact, the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is largely involuntary. That is, we don't have a great deal of conscious control over it. Its role is to monitor the internal environment of our bodies and influence a change to restore homeostasis. Our sympathetic nervous system sympathizes with a situation, and it triggers a fight or flight response. It gets our heart pumping blood to our limbs for fighting or running. It quickens our breathing to maximize oxygen intake for fleeing a situation. Our parasympathetic nervous system acts in opposite. This is referred to as our rest and digest. When our parasympathetic nervous system kicks in, our heart rate slows and blood is redirected to our gastrointestinal tract so that we can continue to digest food. Immediate danger has subsided and we can relax. However, it is important to know that these two nervous systems never switch off and on. Instead, they fight with each other constantly. When our heart is racing, it is because the sympathetic nervous system is dominant, but the parasympathetic nervous system is working to oppose the ever-increasing heart rate that our sympathetic nervous system is trying to induce. The act of the oppositional systems allows our heart to beat fast, but never so fast as to explode. Likewise, when we are really calm, our parasympathetic division slows our heart down. But it doesn't stop because the sympathetic system is fighting back and keeping us with a heart rate if it drops too low. So these two divisions do not switch off and on, but instead teeter like a well-balanced seesaw. So the ANS has two divisions, and almost all organs receive both sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation that exerts antagonistic or oppositional effects on each other. The sympathetic produces effects that are advantageous for fight or flight, and the parasympathetic helps us to conserve energy for normal bodily function. The organs receive parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation by visceral motor efferents, whereas they convey to the brain information about their condition by general sensory efferents. Similar to the general sensory afferents, similar to the afferents of the somatic nervous system. The visceral motor efferents act on the smooth muscle of the organs like the gut and the heart muscle, and the glands to induce or inhibit secretion. Let's have a look at the autonomic division of the PNS and see if we could see any similarities or differences to the somatic division. The autonomic visceral sensory fibres, or afferent fibres, take information from the sensory receptors of the organs to the CNS via the dorsal route. This is similar to the way somatic sensory afferents fibres work. The autonomic visceral motor fibres, or the afferent fibres, take the information to the organ via the ventral route, but which is also very similar, except, stop for a second, these do not originate from the ventral grey horn. No, that's because of this. The lateral grey horn. Those nerves coming from the spinal cord to the organ come from the lateral grey horn, which, if you remember back to our first video when we looked at the cross-section of the spinal cord, you'll remember that they only arise from T1 to L2 and S2 to S4. So we know that some innervation from the autonomic nervous system arises from the spinal cord, but they can only arise from the levels T1 to L2 or S2 to S4. The visceral efferents, so those fibres travelling from the CNS to the organ, are creating a 2-neuron chain. The body of the first neuron is located in the brainstem or the spinal cord, and the body of the second neuron is sat in an autonomic ganglion. So the first neuron is termed a preganglionic neuron, whilst the second neuron is termed a postganglionic neuron. The preganglionic neuron is before the ganglion, and the postganglionic neuron is the neuron after the ganglion. But how does that look in practice? Well, on this slide we can see that fibres travel from the CNS to the organ, so the visceral efferents are subdivided. we have the sympathetic on the left and the parasympathetic on the right. All of these fibres are efferent fibres. They all cause a change in an organ or gland. And if you look at both pictures, we can see, as we mentioned earlier, that most of these organs get sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation. We can see the pupil at the top and the submandibular and sublingual glands, the heart, the lungs, all the way down to the internal and external genitalia. However, what is really useful is how we divide up the origins of each of the autonomic system. The sympathetic nervous system is divided the sympathetic nervous system innervation to the organs arises from something we call the sympathetic chain and the paravertebral ganglia. And the parasympathetic innervation arises from the cranial nerves, mostly, and S2 to S4 lateral grey horns. But don't worry, we'll go through this in a moment. So now we'll take this one step at a time and look at the parasympathetic innervations to the organs. The parasympathetic innervation to the organs follows the same pattern that we saw with the two neuron chain. For the majority of the organs, these neurons arise from the brainstem. But for the organs in the pelvic cavity, they arise from S2 to S4 in the spinal cord. Both nerves are preganglionic nerves that respond to acetylcholine neurotransmitters. At the end of their journey, they synapse in a local ganglion and release acetylcholine to trigger a single synapsing neuron or postganglionic neuron, which reaches the effector organ, releases acetylcholine and inflicts a change. Which of these cranial nerves carry parasympathetic fibres? Well, we have the oculomotor nerve carrying parasympathetic innervation to the pupil, the facial nerve to the salivary and lacrimal glands, the glossopharyngeal to the parotid, and the vagus nerves to the cardiac and pulmonary and digestive systems. On this slide, we can see the parasympathetic innervation from the cranial nerves and the pelvic splanchnic nerves, those nerves that arise from S2 to S4 region of the spinal cord. We can see that the oculomotor, the facial and the glossopharyngeal are isolated to the head, whilst the vagus does virtually everything in the trunk with the exception of the pelvic organs, as parasympathetic innervation by the pelvic splanchnic nerves that arise from S2 to S4. Now let's have a look at the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system arises entirely from the spinal cord, specifically from a smallish window between T1 and L2. The preganglionic fibres arise from this region and release acetylcholine to transmit the signal to the postganglionic neuron. Except, contrary to the parasympathetic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system synapses with many postganglionic fibres, which means there is a widespread effect of the sympathetic nervous system, which makes sense, doesn't it? Because it's the body's best interest to respond hugely and quickly to a perceived threat. We haven't got time when we are being chased by a tiger to wait for the messages to reach all of the systems on a one-to-one basis. We need a response quick and fast. The postsynaptic neurons release noradrenaline or norepinephrine at their target sites, except for the sweat glands, which respond to a different neurotransmitter. So we have alluded to the sympathetic chain, but what is it and where is it located? Well, in short, the sympathetic chain sits either side of the body of the vertebrae, spanning the full length of the vertebrae. It sits like a chain of pearls with a pair of swellings or pearls for each vertebral level. Each of these swellings is a ganglion housing a cell body of the postganglionic neuron. The preganglionic fibres can only exit the spinal cord between T1 and L2, but they can enter the sympathetic chain and ascend or descend according to the structure they need to go and innervate. This means that although the preganglionic fibres must exit in this small window, they are able to travel the length of the chain and innervate the structures of the face, all the way down to the pelvis, despite being higher and lower than where the preganglionic fibres can exit. So the sympathetic chain works a bit like a distribution hub or a highway for sympathetic innervation. Preganglionic fibres leave their spinal cord from the lateral grey horn and through the ventral root, where they enter the sympathetic chain and either synapse in the chain at the ganglion, or they are shot up and down before the synapse with a postganglionic neuron. What does this look like in practice? Well, there are three ways in which the preganglionic neurons can synapse with a postganglionic neuron. Look at number 1 on the diagram. They can synapse at the point of entry to the sympathetic chain. So a sympathetic neuron travelling from T3 can synapse at the sympathetic ganglion sat at the level of T3. This would be described as a synapse at entry-level paravertebral sympathetic ganglia. For an alternative route, look at number 2. Here, the preganglionic nerve leaves the spinal cord and enters the sympathetic chain, but it does not synapse here. Instead, the axon travels straight through. The preganglionic axon continues until it reaches something called a collateral ganglion, where it synapses the postganglionic neuron before being directed to the appropriate organ. We see this a lot with the gut structures. Option 3 leaves us with climbing or descending. Once the preganglionic fibre enters the sympathetic chain, it can either ascend towards the head and neck or descend towards the pelvis before synapsing with the sympathetic chain level required by the target organ. We can see these in more detail here. Option 1. Preganglionic fibres from the sympathetic nervous system travel from the lateral grey horn and through the ventral root of the spinal segment, where they synapse in the ganglion. Once they do this, the postganglionic fibre exits the sympathetic chain at the same level and travels towards the effector organ. In this case, the cardiopulmonary system. They can also synapse and travel to the body wall via the spinal nerves for innervating the skin for sweating. Option 2 is where the preganglionic fibres travel from the lateral grey horn and straight through the sympathetic chain at the same level. This is where it synapses at a collateral ganglion. Option 3 is where the preganglionic sympathetic fibres travel to the sympathetic chain and either ascend, as in this case, or descend, both before synapsing within the sympathetic ganglion. Let's have a quick look at autonomic afferents now. These are not sympathetic or parasympathetic fibres. They are sensory fibres that come from the organs and therefore play a huge role in sending feedback to the CNS about the state of the organ. These sensory fibres, or visceral afferent fibres, travel from the organ through the dorsal root and synapse in the dorsal grey horn. Very similar to those somatic afferent fibres transmitting pain from the skin. In fact, it is this property that gives us a characteristic referred pain. Referred pain is where pain is perceived in a different location to where the damage is actually present. The visceral afferents and the somatic afferents may enter the spinal cord at the same level. They will both synapse with a second order neuron in the dorsal grey horn. From here, they they will transmit in the same manner. So the second order neuron crosses the midline and enters the contralateral spinothalamic tract, where eventually it is relayed to the thalamus and enter the appropriate area of cortex. This happens when the visceral afferents enter at the same level as the somatic afferents. So certain organs can present as pain in the same dermatome that the visceral afferent enters. For the heart, the visceral and the somatic afferents enter the spinal cord at C4, which results in the dermatomes of that area experiencing pain, characterized by pain in the arm. To bring this right back around, let's tie in what we know about the causation between anxiety and the autonomic nervous system, and why this will be relevant in your dentistry careers. The hypothalamus in the brain has overall control of the autonomic regulation. This sends messages to the brainstem centres, for instance, the cardiovascular and the respiratory systems. The brainstem then influences the spinal cord centres for urination, defecation, erection, and ejaculation, for example. Each of these actions release hormones which act on the brainstem centres. Without getting into too much detail, as it is beyond the module, but it is helpful to understand how this works. An erection gets the heart racing. Having an erection sends hormones to the brain to increase the heart rate. Once ejaculation occurs, hormones are released to slow the heart rate back down. So one is sympathetic and one is parasympathetic. But both involve the release of chemicals which signals to the brainstem to act on the heart, one to increase it, one to decrease it. We also have a visceral afferent input back to the brain, which is going to feed forward the effect on the brainstem and the spinal cord centres. These can keep cycling up and down over and over again, keeping the balance and allowing for sympathetic and parasympathetic positive and negative feedback loops. However, those messages are also relayed to the cerebrum, which conveys an emotional response. And that emotional response will affect one way or another the response of the autonomic nervous system. So we can find ourselves getting stuck in a positive feedback cycle. This is what happens with anxiety. The brain perceives danger. It tells the hypothalamus to tell the brainstem and the spinal cord to accelerate the heart, breathe heavily, start sweating, and stop the salivary glands secreting. The effects produced by the sympathetic nervous system feed back a selection of hormones to the brain, which in turn feeds back to the emotional response centres. They don't like this feeling and they panic more, and consequently that feedback loop is positive and the anxiety increases. This effect is very useful if we are running away from a tiger, but not quite so desirable if we are sitting in a dentist chair. And that draws us to an end. Your learning objectives should now be met. You should now be able to distinguish between the somatic nervous system and the visceral or autonomic nervous system. Distinguish between the sympathetic, parasympathetic divisions of the ANS in terms of function. Describe the basic organisation of the autonomic efferents using the appropriate terminology: preganglionic neurons, autonomic ganglion, postganglionic neurons, and effector. Describe the organisation of the parasympathetic nervous system. Name and locate the cranial nerves carrying parasympathetic fibres. Describe the organisation of the sympathetic nervous system. And outline the role of the sympathetic nervous system in the body's response to anxiety.